So in this version of the app, I've fleshed out the rest of the files with populate model and validate model a bit more. So we're following best practices in both the users and messages sections of our code and kind of combining some of the things we've seen in the last few videos together into a consistent code base in the application. Let's take a look at the code and see what we've done. So here we'll just start with the users list page, and we'll look at the users list handler to start off. Here's the list method. You can see I'm using the user service CFC that we mentioned in the previous video. It is the exact same file as we saw before. Here's our user service that does all the SQL query work for us. And you can see I'm not calling get instance here to get the user service back. I'm using the property tag up on line 16, and we're injecting a user service into this variable for us, and then I'm just using that directly here in my handler. That way I can reuse that service here, here, and down in the save method as well 3 different times without ever having to call get instance in those 3 handlers. I just inject it as one property and reuse it everywhere I want to use it. Here's our list view page. There's nothing really of interest in there. I'm just going to show you that page to make sure that we cover all of the bases and make sure you can see how everything works. So none of the code in here had to change at all when we updated the handler or when we started using the user service. This is all left alone untouched. Reload the page so you can see things running, and I'll click on George Harrison. We'll go into the user's detail page, and let's check out the details handler. Nothing terribly of interest in there. I'm using the injected user service again, calling get user details, returning that back. And in this version of our user service, it's the same as the last one, but it's different from some of the previous instances of this app that we've seen. Instead of calling, well, first of all, instead of returning the query directly, which we were doing in earlier videos, I'm now returning a user's object with all of the properties set inside it. In a previous version of the app, that required calling the 5 different setter methods to set the different properties inside my user object before it was passed back to the calling chunk of code. In this one, I'm using a function called populate from query. That came out of another thing we got from Wirebox called the populator, and I just stuck that into a variable called populator. This is sort of like the populate model method we've seen in previous videos. Here it's called populate from query. I simply pass it the empty object I want to store data in, and in this case I'm giving it the query that I ran up above. Just like we mentioned how naming conventions and keeping consistent with how you name things can allow certain features in Coldbox to work, this is another one of those situations where that's what happens. All of the columns in my query have the same column names as the properties in my user CFC. Because of that, populate from query can just do a one-to-one match and take all of the data out of my query and stick them into the properties in my object. So we went from having 5 lines of code here to set the different properties. Now we have just 1 line of code that sets all the properties in that object, and it gets handed back to the calling file. In this case, it's our handler. So we go back here, get that data back from the service, store it in an object, and then draw it on the details screen here. And you can see I'm just using that user object, calling the different getter methods to draw the contents on the screen as we need to. Our user's model is the exact same model that we saw previously. Nothing much is happening in here. We've got our property tags, our constraints to note which fields are required that our CB validation module will then use to draw error validation messages on the screen. We'll take a look at that now. You can see when I run that, there's our error validation happening in our user file. Now let's take a look at the messages section of our application. Here's the message list page. We'll look at the code here. Here's our message list handler. The only thing of interest really in here is we're using message service again. Instead of calling the method in our model, we've moved it to our message service, and we're injecting our services using those property inject tags like we saw previously. Let's take a look at our message service read method now. Here's read, and you can see it takes a message ID in. If we passed it in, it looks for that specific item in our database and then creates a message object, returns that object back to the calling chunk of code. You can see again here we're using that populate from query method that we talked about in the user section. I'm just passing in the empty object I want to populate and the query record that has the exact same named columns in it as the properties in our object. Coldbox can then do a one-to-one match and stick everything we need into our object and return that back to the calling chunk of code. If we didn't give it a valid message ID, we simply run a straight SQL query, and return the query results back. So this is the code for our list page, and this is the code for our details page. Let's take a look at our list page real quick. This page runs how you expect it to run. There's nothing new or of interest in here. And our details page works the same way as the user's detail page does, where instead of referencing direct columns from the database query, we're simply calling the getter methods from inside that message object that got returned to us. When I save a message, we of course run the messages.save handler. Let's take a look at that now. Message is saved down here. This is a little bit more complicated than the user save method that we saw previously. It starts off the same way. I call populate model and validate model, get our model created, and then validate it using the CB validation module. Lines 48 through 55, we're just checking that validation results return value. If we got some errors back, then call get all errors, save that into a variable called errors on line 50. And then we're going to relocate to the message detail page where we'll draw those errors on the screen. We're passing the errors and the message ID back to the detail handler here with our persist struct attribute, just like we did in the user section. And then the else block of code, lines 56 through 68. If we did not get an error, then we're going to simply either create a new record or update an existing record, depending on what kind of data we're dealing with here. Let's take a look at our message service create method. And you can see create looks like so. It simply does an insert statement. You pass it in an object. It runs query execute and inserts that record into the database, returning you back a valid object. If we call update, that's if we got a message ID greater than 0. Update looks like this. You give it the message object. It runs a SQL update statement. And again, it's using the getter methods to get the different values out of that object as we need to. Executing the query, and then it just returns that object back to the database for us, or back to the calling chunk of code rather. We've got a delete handler in here as well that simply deletes a record out of the system. Again, it's also in the message service CFC. Let's take a look at that now. That's down here. You pass it a message ID and it runs a delete statement for you. It doesn't actually return anything. A couple other things of note here in the message service CFC. I'm again using that populator object that got injected for us from Wirebox. That's where the populate from query functionality comes from. We don't have to actually call get Wirebox or get an instance of anything. I can use property tags here in my service, just like I do here in my handler. And you can see in my message handler, we've actually got 4 things being injected in here for different reasons. We've got a messages object, we've got the both message and user services, and even the HTML helpers are being injected in here as well. So there's no limit to how many things you can inject with the property tags. It just depends on how much functionality you need in your handler and how much memory you have on your server. The messages model CFC looks pretty similar to the users one that we saw previously. I've got property tags at the top, just like before, and I've got my constraints here in the middle. Message body and subject are both marked as required, and user ID is marked as required, and it's also marked as type numeric. So it's not only required, but if you give it a user ID, it has to be numeric data. If you try to give it an email address or some alphanumeric string of characters, this will actually throw a validation error for us, just like leaving a required field blank would do. And there you have it. Now we've got much more functionality, more validation, self-documenting business rules in both of our model objects, and we're using Wirebox more to create objects and services for us automatically as well. So the bulk of the code we wrote is actually functionality for our app and very little boilerplate cruft that we have to write just to continue development. We're way more productive now per line of code than we were in previous versions of the app. You can learn more about CB validation, Wirebox, and the other related functionality on the website at coldbox.ortusbooks.com, or you can learn about CB validation stuff at coldbox-validation.ortusbooks.com, which is the URL you see on your screen right now.